My name is Laura. 15 years ago, my sister Sarah took James away from me. Not just a boyfriend, but my fiancé. The wedding was supposed to be in a month. James and Sarah, my sister and my fiancé. A betrayal I swore I would never forgive. That day, I boarded a train. Just as I was walking toward my compartment, I distinctly heard Sarah's voice. 15 years of silence hadn't erased those intonations from my memory. I froze at the entrance to the compartment, gripping my ticket tightly. Sarah was sitting by the window, staring absent-mindedly at the platform, not noticing me yet. I had just seconds to decide: leave, ask to be moved to another carriage, or step in and pretend to be a stranger. The train jolted as I entered the compartment. "I believe this is my seat," I said politely. Sarah turned at the sound of my voice, and I saw her eyes widen in recognition. After a moment of hesitation, she slipped on the same mask of polite indifference as I wore. "Hello," Sarah responded, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her phone. "Yes, of course. Make yourself comfortable." It was an unspoken agreement to pretend, to play the roles of strangers, to act like we didn't recognize each other. My suitcase barely fit onto the overhead shelf. I felt my sister's gaze on me, but refused to turn around. There were 2 other passengers in the compartment, an elderly couple watching the new arrival with interest. "Are you traveling far?" the elderly woman asked, while inspecting her homemade pies suspiciously. "To the end of the line," I replied, sitting down across from my sister. "Same here," Sarah added. "I'm heading to a funeral." I tensed. So she was also going to Aunt Helen's, the only person who tried to reconcile us all these years. Of course, I could have guessed. The atmosphere in the compartment grew oddly tense as the elderly couple exchanged glances. At that moment, the door slid open with some effort after a few sharp attempts, and in walked the train attendant, a tall woman with a straight posture and sharp eyes. "Good evening," she declared solemnly. "Life is a train, not a station," as the Dalai Lama used to say. Or was it Jim Morrison? She frowned for a moment, then waved the thought away. "My name is Grace Thompson, and I'll be your attendant. Tea? Coffee?" She scanned the compartment and briefly lingered on me and my sister. "Oh, I sensed something special here. Compartment 6 never gets the mix of passengers wrong." While everyone made their orders, I noticed the medallion hanging around the attendant's neck, a vintage oval-shaped piece, the kind that usually holds photos of loved ones. The train began moving, and the platform in Chicago slowly started to drift away beyond the window. I pulled out a book, but I couldn't concentrate. The letters blurred on the page. I could feel Sarah's presence so vividly, as if an invisible thread stretched between us, vibrating with every slightest movement. "Do you know this train is considered the most unpredictable on the whole line?" the elderly man suddenly announced loudly, folding his newspaper. "My nephew once rode in it and swore the car could decide on its own when to stop." At the first stop, the elderly couple unexpectedly packed up and left. They hurriedly exited the compartment, leaving me and Sarah alone. "Like they were evacuating from a war zone," Sarah unexpectedly remarked, looking after them. "A hot spot of some imaginary front." I didn't answer. I couldn't let myself show even the smallest sign that I recognized her. Not after. The memories came flooding back with relentless clarity. James, averting his eyes, saying there would be no wedding, and Sarah, standing next to him with his familiar sports bag in her hands, also refused to look at me. "I'm sorry," was all my sister said before the door clicked shut. The compartment door suddenly slid open, and there stood the attendant. Some people are afraid of zucchini, she said, as if picking up a conversation she'd been having elsewhere. And a train, is like an X-ray. It reveals the true nature of its passengers right away. I call it the rail therapy effect. And just as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished, leaving us baffled. What? Does she have microphones in here? Sarah muttered. I buried my face in my book, though I still couldn't read a single word. A heavy silence settled between us, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of train wheels. The lights in the compartment flickered and then became unbearably bright. It's always like this, Sarah muttered, shielding her eyes with her hand. When you need light, it's never there. But when you want darkness, there's a spotlight in your face. She pulled a sweater from her bag and placed it on the upper shelf. A minute later, she jumped up and replaced it with a t-shirt. The compartment suddenly became uncomfortably warm, only to switch to a chill as if on a whim. Our carriage is always like this, came the attendant's voice again as she reappeared in the doorway. First, it tries to test the passenger's temperature preferences. Then it settles on an average. Usually, it misses the mark, but it always tries with such enthusiasm. With that, the attendant disappeared again, and the compartment sank back into tense silence. Sarah stared out the window, but saw not the passing suburbs of Chicago or train stations, only her own reflection and mine, layered behind hers. 15 years, half a lifetime. Of course, I'd changed. I'd grown stricter, colder, but it was still me, with my straight posture, precise movements, and neatly styled hair. What does she think of me now? I wondered. Sarah looked tired. The past years clearly hadn't been kind. After her divorce from James, she had to work hard to support herself and her daughter. Being self-employed gave her freedom, but not much stability. Aunt Helen passed away 2 days ago. Her heart. I received the telegram yesterday morning and immediately got a ticket. Although at first, they mistakenly delivered me a telegram about winning a gold-plated iron intended for some Sam Peterson. Aunt Helen was the last of the senior generation who still kept in touch with me after the fallout with my sister. Tea, ladies? The attendant reappeared in the compartment, knocking 3 times on the door until it consented to open. Here you go. Biscuits, cookies, sugar, add as you like. Tea, like life, isn't about strength but soulfulness, as my grandmother used to say. She winked, adding, I've never had a passenger in this carriage who couldn't be reconciled over tea, even those pretending not to know each other. She placed the glasses in their holders on the small table, glanced at us again, and asked, Haven't we met before? Your face looks so familiar. By any chance, were you at the conductors' conference in Denver last year? I don't think so, I replied, shaking my head. And you two aren't relatives, are you? The attendant glanced between us. No, we replied simultaneously, freezing as we exchanged looks. Grace thoughtfully touched her medallion. Well, isn't that something? You look so alike. In my carriage, I can almost always tell who's related. In my 30 years as a conductor, I've reunited 9 pairs of twins and even a whole football team with their coach. I'm especially proud of the latter, a misunderstanding involving a sandwich, a split eyebrow, and the director of the sports school. The attendant gave us one last strange look and left the compartment, leaving us in awkward silence. She definitely knows something, Sarah whispered. Or she imagines she does. It's like she thinks this carriage is some kind of magical portal for reuniting lost souls. I didn't respond. My mind was elsewhere, back on that day, the ring thrown onto the table and the tickets for the honeymoon lying nearby. We didn't mean for this to happen. James had said, as though that somehow excused anything, as though love was something you stumbled into like catching the flu. I took a sip of the tea and winced unexpectedly. "Too strong," I muttered, as bitter as this silence. Sarah glanced at me, and for a brief moment recognition flickered in her eyes, but she quickly looked away. It was still too soon to break the invisible wall between us. Outside, darkness fell, and now our reflections in the window grew sharper. Two women, alike and yet strangers, trapped in the mirrored prison of the train's glass. "You know," the attendant appeared again, as if materializing out of thin air. "Once, two sisters traveled in this very compartment. They hadn't spoken to each other in 15 years. Imagine that. 15 years. It's practically a lifetime. In that time, you could learn 3 languages, travel the entire world, or raise a child." I flinched. Sarah dropped her spoon. "And what happened to them?" she asked hoarsely. "Oh, the most interesting part," the attendant said. "The train suddenly stopped in the middle of a field. No station, just tracks and endless sunflowers on the horizon. And then, the lights went out. Completely. You know, that kind of darkness where you can't even see your own hand, and when the lights came back on..." She paused dramatically. They were hugging and crying. Turns out, all those years, each one had kept a photo of the other in her bag. Sarah shot to her feet. I need to step out." "The restroom is at the end of the car," the attendant said helpfully. "But be careful with the door. It sometimes locks by itself. And hold on to the handrails. It's always a bit bumpy on this stretch." As soon as Sarah left, the attendant leaned toward me. "You know, sometimes the hardest part isn't forgiving, but admitting to yourself that you've already forgiven long ago. Pride is a stubborn thing. By the way, you wouldn't happen to have a picture in your wallet, would you?" "No," I replied too quickly, feeling heat rise to my cheeks. But I did have a photo, an old, worn one. It was of Sarah at her graduation, laughing and holding a bouquet of lilacs. At that moment, the train jolted sharply, the lights flickered, and then went out completely. Somewhere down the corridor, I heard a panicked cry. Sarah's. It had to be. The darkness was absolute. "Don't worry," came the calm voice of the attendant. "This is normal. The train just decided it was time." "Time for what?" I asked, but there was no reply. It seemed she had disappeared as quietly as she had arrived. "Help me!" Sarah's voice called again, strained. "The door is stuck!" I got up, holding on to the walls for balance as I made my way down the corridor. In the dark, each step felt endless. "Where are you?" "Here! In the restroom! The damn door!" I found the handle. "Hold on," I said. "I'll get it open." But it wouldn't budge. "You know," Sarah said suddenly, her voice muffled through the door, "I've regretted it every single day. Every day for 15 years. James? He left a year later. Said he couldn't live with the guilt. And I was left alone. Without my sister. Without my husband. Only with this guilt." I pressed my forehead against the cold door. "Why didn't you call? Would you have answered?" "No," I admitted honestly. "Probably not. Not back then." "And now?" I stayed silent. It was easier to speak the truth in the dark. "You know," Sarah continued, "I have a daughter. She's 13. I named her after you." Something clicked in the lock, and the door suddenly swung open. Sarah practically fell into my arms. At the same moment, the lights flickered back on, bright, almost blinding. We stood in the corridor, holding each other and crying. Somewhere in the distance, we could hear the attendant humming softly about zucchini and sunflowers. "I've kept your photo," I whispered. "From your graduation." "And I've kept yours, from the day you won that award for your first article." We went back to the compartment, holding hands like we used to as kids. On the table, 2 fresh glasses of tea were steaming. Where they had come from, we had no idea. "You know," the attendant appeared in the doorway as if she had been waiting for this moment. "They say this train doesn't just carry passengers, it reconnects the broken threads of fate. But only if people are ready. You can't mend what doesn't want to be mended." She reached into the pocket of her uniform and pulled out an envelope. "Oh, I nearly forgot. A telegram for you." I unfolded the paper. "Aunt Helen, she's alive. It was a mistake. They mixed her up with another patient. She's fine and asking for both of us to come to her." "Well, what a coincidence." The attendant smiled, adjusting her medallion. "Just like the story about the 2 sisters who rode in compartment 6, Sarah interrupted. "No," the attendant replied mysteriously. "The 2 who are riding in it now." She turned to leave but paused at the door. "Oh, and about Sam Peterson and his golden iron. You know, sometimes telegrams end up in the wrong hands because they're meant to, just like people on trains." The door closed behind her. Sarah and I exchanged glances and, for the first time in 15 years, burst into laughter. "You know," Sarah said, "I think I'm starting to believe in the magic of compartment 6. The next day, we were all sitting together in Aunt Helen's garden. Me, Sarah, and my namesake niece, who turned out to be a spitting image of both of us in our youth. Grace, the attendant, had been right. Sometimes trains, like the paths they follow, guide you exactly where you need to be. Before bidding us farewell, Grace finally opened her medallion, revealing an old photograph of 2 smiling young sisters, herself and another Grace, the one she had also reconciled with years ago, right there in compartment 6. Did you like the story? Write your opinion in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next interesting story. See you tomorrow.